should be there. Yeah, but I want to bring this back. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's okay. I think it's setting within that you choose to be able to kind of see your own notes, but if it's, I can bring up my computer. Try one more time. This window is just for you to place it on the screen.
So, ma'am, you're my bag sister.
Oh, on the screen, only I can see. This one goes on the other screen. Yeah. Oh well. I'll bring up my own computer and I'll just read from there. It might be just like the projection situation.
So we hope everyone's been having a great convention. Yes. You know, brings a whole different spirit into the conference, you know.
It's always the best day. I feel like Saturdays are always the best days of these conferences because it's full of dancers or archers or whatever like giant other conventions happen. Thanks for your patience. I was hoping I've got notes in this presentation, but I'll just have to read some of them here. And thanks for joining on final day and early-ish on the final day. I hope the conference has been good for everybody. I guess we'll introduce ourselves as we come up. So Patrick is technically the chair, so I'm not going to like introduce all of you. My name is Brice Nordquist. I'm at Syracuse University, and I want to think about our institutional moment. And I think when we proposed this, we all have these different kinds of literacy networks that we're going to be talking about. That we will still think about. But as I was framing this talk for mine, I wanted to think about the ways that these writing practices, literacy practices across the different communities that we're working in could help us rethink or think differently about an institution or institutions at this particular moment. So I want to start by asking you to do a little bit of work, maybe like less than 1 minute of work. If you've got something to sketch with or notes to take, you've got to be good students and get your pencils out. If you don't, just imagine something in your mind. That'll be fine. We won't take too much time. So I've been asking this question in all kinds of contexts lately because it's been, it's been on my mind a lot. Maybe any of us who have been in kind of administrative positions This is like pressing. You're confronted with different conceptions of what an institution actually is across all the different contexts of your work, from the scale of a classroom up to the scale of an entire university or college or school. So just for a moment, I won't say any more because I don't want to give anything away. You should sketch out, like, what shapes will come to mind when you think about an institution as a whole. How do you think about the parts of it in relationship to the whole, its constituent parts, and how would you represent those? Even if you want to put down how you typically see them represented in your daily work. So I'll give you 30 seconds. You should time and stop me. I don't mind. All right, you can keep sketching, or keep thinking about this. We'll come back to it in a second. For now, I want to think about the representations of institutions, and really from the perspective of the seeming impossibility of change. So these are critiques of institutional stasis from within the institution, primarily, from other academics, or from people who have a stake in higher education and want to pursue sort of transformation or reform. So I'll just read a couple. This book by Brian Rosenberg, who's a former university president, I think of Carleton, maybe, has got this book called Whatever It Is, I'm Against It, that's getting tons of traction across like upper level administration and higher education. So it's something to read. It's problematic in many ways, although it's also like highly entertaining, and it's something to be aware of because a lot of university administrators are reading it, and there's a lot of kind of discourse around it. Rosenberg says that the maintenance of the status quo is the goal. Higher education has managed to create an ideal system. These are things that we hear all the time, and not only from administrators, we hear them across all scales of the university. Kathy Davidson, who many of you, I'm sure, know, is writing as somebody who's pushing for educational transformation or change. She says it will not be easy to transform the university from the inside. Many academics are traditionalists, and many institutions revere their traditions and are rewarded for them. They often reject innovation simply because it represents a departure from how things are done. So these are critiques that we're familiar with, right? And you could fill pages and pages and pages of this kind of particular critique. And you hear it across all your meetings, like faculty meetings, university senate meetings, courses, graduate courses, whatever you're involved in. This is a refrain that it feels like a common refrain. I hope, I think for us. This is an interview from yesterday on the Daily, New York Times The Daily, with Christopher Rufo, who is kind of named or accredited as being the architect of the current attack on higher education. Rufo's like sort of activism to transform higher education has been going on for a decade now or so, and most journalists, people in the media kind of attribute his model for the model that the Trump administration is following. I'm sure it's more complex than that, but Rufo's ideas have been incredibly formative for the current administration. So in this, again, talking about change and how change can sort of be instigated. Rufo says, I'm thinking about how we can take away their money, how we can take away their power, how we can take away their status, to the point that we're causing so much pain to the decision makers. In this case, he's talking about the ousting of the Harvard president. In this case, of the Harvard Corporation, so that they have to change. If these representations of change, and it's sort of the forces that either cannot change it, or the kinds of tactics required to change it from completely different, sort of sides of a political spectrum, and most places in between. So I want to, in this kind of quick presentation, I want to consider the seeming impossibility of change or reform, not only for higher education, but for extended U.S. educational system, like K through 16, because, of course, these grade levels are as under threat as our current, our current higher education context, and it's intertwined, obviously. And I want to take up this consideration in the context of what feels like, a rhetoric of kind of impending institutional collapse from both sides, and it feels like for a long time. So from the left, this collapse feels inevitable because our institutions were built on colonial, patriarchal, supremacist, and increasingly, neoliberal sort of systems or foundations. So, in many discourses, like free market capitalism, also built on these foundations, the system is not sustainable. So this is a critique that we've been steeped in and we're familiar with. From the right, the predominance of ideologies critiquing and resisting these forces are the problem themselves, right? So those critiques based on, feminist, Black, indigenous, BIPOC scholars, but also critical theorists and critical pedagogues. These are exactly the problem. And the only way to address this problem is with blunt force, like Rufo says, like with a chainsaw. So many of us now are in a position of defending and preserving institutions we've spent careers critiquing and trying to transform. And it's a strange, it's a weird pivot to make. Frankly, and it might be, I haven't heard a lot of direct address of this current context here this week. That's not a critique. I think part of it might just be because it's hard to be in this particular position. It might not be the only reason for I won't say silence, but the sort of the lack of a direct address, because we're in this tension in between. So I want to think about that, the place we're in, and I want to consider how the impossibility of this position, or what feels like the impossibility of this position, either of change by revolution, like I think that in some ways we've been pursuing institutional change by revolution, or the counter-revolution, which is what Rufo calls what that movement is, a counter-revolution against a society that is, that is represented by DEI and by sort of equity and justice, right? So this, Rufo, he thinks this is what they're up to. So I want to think about how the seeming impossibility is due in part to the ways that we conceptualize institutions. So back to that first sketching activity that I asked you to do. I want to go way back to Lakoff and Johnson's metaphors we live by, to think about how our ordinary conceptual system, the terms in which we act and think, is fundamentally metaphorical in nature. And as Lakoff and Johnson say here, our concepts structure what we perceive, how we get around in the world, how we relate to other people, how our conceptual system plays a central role in defining things, our everyday reality. So I'll have to pick up the pace. So this is also, I would I think we know this, we take it as a given, our kind of assumptions, beliefs, assumptions shape our perceptions, and our perceptions shape our actions and practices. And I think I want to think about the ways that we imagine the institutions that we work in, that we sort of help to co-constitute as an interesting point of inquiry. All right, so if you look down at your sketch or into your mind about how you were imagining this institution, I wanted us to think about what kinds of shapes are represented there. I think Lakoff and Johnson talk about the kind of prevalence of container metaphors of we have a sense of, oftentimes our metaphors for institutions are containerized. So there are some like theorists here, or anthropologists, or philosophers of space-time that call this kind of a logic of inversion. And I've written about this in terms of mobility systems, but this logic of inversion turns pathways into boundaries, so the kind of containment, they turn trails into sort of spaces of containment. Movement occurs like between these pre-existing destinations. I think these are like kind of concepts that we're familiar with. The name of this talk is taken from this fantastic book. Maybe you've already read it, on Entangled Life, by Merlin Sheldrake, who's writing about fungi, which has been like an obsession of mine since seeing this like mushroom at the end of the world. But Sheldrake says that if we only have words that describe neatly bounded autonomous individuals, it's easy to think they actually exist. And I do think that I think when we're theorizing our context, we think of them as heterogeneous, we think of them as interconnected, but we slip always, at least in my world, we're slipping always into this idea of an institution as a container, or it being a kind of, collection of separate containers. And I think that makes it pretty easy to attack from all sides. So here's like visual representations. This is Syracuse University that, loves to show its own buildings. Many of our institutions do, from aerial views, right? But you get this kind of containerized metaphor working visually, you get it working in discourse or text, it's all over the place. Of course, you see it all across other stages of education. Most of our like graphs or charts or visualizations of education are based on these kinds of like modularized processes where certain kinds of practices are taken up in certain kinds of spaces. As an alternative, I've written about institutions as mobility systems, and particularly schools as mobility systems. So in this kind of configuration, the places themselves are made from the mobilities that sort of circulate through them. So they're junctures, like places are junctures of mobility. Mobilities of people, things, ideas, practices. These mobility systems regulate, shape, and constrain how we move. At the same time, as they're constraining us, the institution itself is constituted by mobilities. So I'll skip a lot of that sort of theorization. I've kind of gone over it in other places. But I want to think about, I'm interested in focusing primarily on this idea of mobility systems as sites where we resist and reconfigure mobilities through our own practices, relationships, and aspirations, often in ways that challenge institutional norms and logics. And so at this point in time, the point in time where we're kind of like thinking about challenges and conceptualizations of the recalcitrance of higher education to change from multiple perspectives, I want to think about the places where our conceptions ignore the shapes that we're making through institutions. They ignore the complexity and the reach beyond bounds of institutions. So I want to do that, and I have to like sort of move forward quickly. Seth, how much time do you think we have now? 2? If that, okay. I want to give a quick model of a network that we built at Syracuse called the Engaged Humanities Network. So we started this 5 years ago. And I wanted to sort of trace out the shape of this network, although that slide is not coming up. There we go. So the Engaged Humanities Network is a center or a network for publicly engaged research, teaching, and creative work that spans across disciplines, that also spans across communities in Syracuse and Central New York, that involves faculty, students of all levels, staff, community partners as kind of cohorts that are working from, teams of people working on water quality in the Valley of Syracuse after demolition, to creative writing groups or arts groups for youth in community centers or local libraries. There are many different facets of this network, different programs. They're all cohort-based, so the people working on these projects across disciplines come together, workshop ideas, collectively problem solve, intersect or collaborate when they can. And I wanted to trace just quickly through how this network is shaped by the movements of people sort of constituting a movement across the work. So in Syracuse, when I first moved there, I want to think about the trajectory of Rayan, who's a student that I've been working with since she was a sophomore in high school. And I want to think about the ways that her movements across these, different programs, different kinds of educational contexts, can help us rethink what an institution is or does and what it looks like distributed across like space and time. So Rayan I met, as I said, when she was a sophomore in high school. She had just come to the United States for resettlement process from Kenya. Her family are Somali. Maybe in her first year of high school, so the second year she was here. I met her at the Northside Learning Center, where I've been working in Syracuse for a decade now, running different kinds of arts programs, writing programs, civic engagement. And so Rayan joined a program that we created called the Nordquist Fellowship, which is a program that connects cohorts of resettled refugee youth to artists that have refugee or immigrant backgrounds. They do kind of a year-long storytelling program. And we have a collaboration with the Metropolitan Museum of Art. They share their work in that space, and then they come back to Syracuse and do a number of different workshops, events, lead sessions, and lead different programs. So this program has been going on for, we're moving into our 6th year. We've worked with 80 fellows. We've had, they've shared their work in publications and different venues, presentations across the nation. After Rayan did the Nordquist Fellowship in her sophomore year, she was a junior in high school when she started this program at the Northside Learning Center called the Speaking Circle, which is like a kind of public speaking initiative for kids that are coming to the Northside, high school kids primarily. And she started it with Andy Ridgway, who's now a professor at Memphis University, graduated from our PhD program at Syracuse and was a graduate assistant for the Engaged Humanities. So this is a particular project that trains students to give speeches at their local school board meetings. So every school board meeting, 3 of these students came, advocated for different things for their communities within their schools, and that continues. So Rayan started it when she was in high school, and it exists today. Now it's led by a colleague in sociology. After this, Rayan moved on to connect with a program that already existed called Write Out, which is a creative writing program that started through Engaged Humanities and now is run across different institutions in New York, both SUNY ESF, SUNY Morrisville, and also SU. This is like a kind of fun, creative writing for middle schoolers, and Rayan sort of helped to support this program. After she graduated high school, she came to Syracuse University to do film. Her Nordquist cohort was focused on filmmaking, and so she took that into pursuit of her degree at Syracuse. She's now helping to coordinate and run this project with her professors in film called Teens with a Movie Camera, also kind of extending this line of enrichment programming, civics, arts, humanities programming across the city of Syracuse. In the 5 years of Engaged Humanities, there are currently 35 active projects. There are 20 kind of new or revised courses across the college, all community engaged. And there are over 400 faculty, staff, students, and then if you add community partners to that, the number is quite large, really more than 50 community-based organizations. So you can connect with Engaged Humanities, and it's not like a promotion for Engaged Humanities. If I wasn't moving so fast, it wouldn't feel so much like that. But I do want to say, I think across our institutions, we're reconfiguring the shapes of the institutions. That projects like the Engaged Humanities are great, but they're not incredibly unique. And you'll hear from Patrick and Seth about the work that they're doing across their different kinds of communities that are also connected in some ways to these. I think that these kinds of configurations are more resilient because they cross institutions, they cross different types of institutions, from community centers to schools to universities. I think that they involve people across different kinds of constituencies than we typically imagine of constituting institutions. And I think that they're not so dependent either on support from a kind of neoliberal university or dependent on kind of federal funding or support from the state. And I think if we're thinking about institutions shaped these ways, I think it's a way of facing the current moment, continuing to do the work of justice and social transformation in the current moment, and trying to do that in coalition across these spaces by reimagining how we conceive of institutions. So I'll stop after that. Thanks very much.
Good morning, everyone. I will say that what I'm going to talk about today is something called Project Mend, and it's something that has benefited greatly from the Engage Humanities Network, not just from the support, but through the collaboration as well, and through the partnership with the different units there. So I put a QR code if you want to have access to the slides and the notes there. So our field and allied fields have oftentimes celebrated writings that taking the work of incarcerated writers and sort of bringing them to the public. This is important work because so often people have no idea what's going on in prisons, and there's real value in bringing this work forward. Yet I will say that one of the things I find myself thinking about is that less attention has been paid to having the incarcerated person, or the person who's been impacted by the criminal legal system, be much more in charge of the editing, production, and circulation of their own work. And that's where I wanted to focus on today. So take, for example, this is a fairly old collection. And in fact, Toby, I think this was a collection you mentioned yesterday. This was a collection that was produced by a retired English professor, where she looked at PEN America's 25 years of best writing, set up this anthology. And this work is a really valuable collection, but I wanted to underscore that the selection process was not done by people who've been justice impacted, it was done by someone else. Now, some of you might say that, think about what we go through our own publishing process. That we submit our manuscripts, our articles, our book projects to, we submit our work to publications, and we have to wait. Someone else is making that decision. But the distinction that I want to underscore is that person making the decision is our peer. And I think that relationship, the power relationship, is different. So for the last 3 years, we're actually moving into our 4th edition, I've been working with justice-impacted people to create the publication Mend. This is a national publication that features the writing of anyone who's been impacted by the criminal legal system. So it features the writing of incarcerated people, formerly incarcerated people, and family members. And I really want to underscore family members because I feel like that oftentimes does not get adequate attention. The last issue, we received more than 200 submissions, so much so that I got a little bit scared because it became hard to manage the number of submissions that come in. But I think how this work is produced is really key. We partner with the Center for Community Alternatives. This is an organization in New York. It serves Syracuse, New York City, and Rochester, and it really is very much connected to advocacy, to building community, and to supporting people after they're released. We're also receiving funds from Humanities New York. I hope, as I said in the workshop when I presented, as I drove here, we got notice that Humanities New York lost all of their NEH funding, and a lot of things got put on hold, but perhaps I think my program is supported by Mellon through Humanities New York, so maybe we're still okay, but this just to go back to what Brice was saying, we're finding ourselves in very vulnerable, precarious situation, and the Engage Humanities Network has also been a key supporter. So just to give you a sense of what happens here, I bring together a group of people in Syracuse, New York, people who've been impacted in some ways. It's an apprenticeship program. They're paid a stipend for participating in the program. And we go through each week, at least during the early part, we go through each manuscript that's submitted. And I think this is something that is really, I find really fascinating, because we're not just going through saying accept, reject, but as people go through reading paragraph by paragraph, you find that they start talking about how this work connects with their own lives, histories, and experiences. And I think this sense of building community has become so important. And once we narrow it down from like over 200 submissions to 15, then we sort of move into a computer lab, and we begin this process of learning how to make the publication, quite literally all aspects of production. So participants are working with the Adobe Creative Cloud, particularly InDesign, which is no easy feat for anyone, but is particularly challenging for people who maybe have been away from technology for a very long time. And we get a lot of support building the network. We are fortunate that we have an internship program with our writing and rhetoric program, so we have undergraduate students that sometimes sign up for internships. We have support through the Engaged Humanities Network and through a research initiative at Syracuse. We also have some graduate students and others who just come to volunteer, which we're very grateful for, but it gives us a chance to provide a lot of like one-on-one support as needed. So just to give you a sample, these are like a sample of the types of layouts that they're producing. They're learning how to edit, how to work with images. We get artwork from across the country as well. Sometimes when we can't find appropriate artwork, they learn how to use art through Creative Commons and different sites where they can do that. Just a couple of layouts. I wrote a few issues here. Please take them if you're interested. Thank you, Seth. Earlier, last semester, we brought Brandon Irby there, and in a piece in Seas, he wrote that when stories of incarcerated people in the United States are given attention via the news media, television programs, or film productions, the narratives that often dominate rely on scenes and language of violence that work to justify various means of captivity. It's easy for us to ignore and therefore accept the troubling and inhumane practices connected to prison culture when the discourse is focused mostly on tropes like the dangerous super predator who has committed murder or the drug dealer who has terrorized the local neighborhood. So I feel like in this publication, we invite submissions of all kinds. So participants may choose to write about prison, they may choose to write about big crimes, but they also may choose not to write about it at all. And we think that this is like a really important and distinctive part of the publication, in that it doesn't really just focus like, this is an anthology that's going to focus only on this one topic. And going back to these troubling stories, I think the one question that's staying with me right now is, who deserves a second chance, or even a third chance? If you think about that, there are a lot of times anthologies related to people who've been impacted by the criminal justice system, and they're political prisoners, or they, we have far too many cases of people who have been in prison only to find out many years later that it's been proven that they're innocent. So we see this like inhumanity, and even for those who commit crime, they're experiencing humanity. But I think that by and large, the group that I'm working with in Project Men, these are people who made mistakes, and it makes me think a lot about how that understanding kind of impacts. I was at the SIG yesterday, and one of the guys who was a formerly incarcerated man, he told all the teachers that please don't look it up, because even if you think you won't be influenced, you might be influenced, which I think is a really interesting commentary about how we sort of deal with this. And just to keep us moving a little bit, I'm really struck by the work of the Prison Policy Initiative. And I think the point that I want to make here is that nearly everyone will be released back to our communities. And so oftentimes we have to think about what's good for them, but what's good for us as a society. And it's clear that prison mass incarceration is not working. It's not really helping people to come out in a I want to share just a couple of brief video clips if everything cooperates. We do a launch party, and so this is some reflections. And in this first one, you're going to hear a reflection by both a Syracuse student and also a person who was part of the group early on.
I think it's made it so much fuller. I feel like I know more about the community and people around me, and I feel like this is the kind of opportunity that I've been looking for. Like, I think as writers and creators, like, we always want to reach out to people who want to create as well and just can't find the space and don't know where to find it. And I'm lucky enough to be in a campus that sort of encourages you to go and find those places. Yeah, we got, like, it was, especially the amount of people that came today, like, it was so moving to see everybody come out.
Me too. Feel more comfortable within my own self, but then also within the community that I was able to become a part of, but then also build once there. Like I said, communicating with other students who were a part of MIN early on, because our cohort was, we dealt with the loss of trees. We also had health issues for a gentleman that was with CCA. So we ended up being only a core group of 4 individuals who were working with editors and helping to make sure that the first iteration of MIN came to life, right, to see what it's expanded to now, right? The purpose has been to engage people in conversations, give others additional platforms, right? So we're in the 3rd edition now, 3rd publication, which also speaks to its own impact, and the number of people who were not only present here in this room, but also online. It's allowing for conversations that are enriching, more substantial about carceral systems, be it inside as well as outside, as well as alternate means by which to go about not only punitive, but supporting children.
So that person was Brian T. Shore. He is now a graduate student at Columbia University pursuing a degree in public health. He was a Syracuse University undergraduate. He was in prison for 16 years, I believe, and is trying to build his life now. But I sort of highlighted that because I think that these conversations and looking at this as being mutually beneficial to the university, thinking about these groups of people that typically don't talk to each other. We did this, our events, we usually do it at the city's library, where I'm learning, I didn't realize this at first, you have a lot of people who've been impacted by the criminal legal system there, and it becomes a way of bringing people together. So we come together, that's Troy White, he's a senior editor on the left, who's been working with me since the beginning. We did a DIA seminar a few years ago, maybe they'll name it something different in the future, and some other things there. But I think and then we oftentimes try to do things at the university, whether it be through our Humanities Center, or through, on the left, we have a session at Freedom Commons, which is a place that provides housing to people who've just been released from prison. And so we've been continuing doing workshops there as well. And maybe just as a way of wrapping up, I wanted to, I'm really thinking a lot about how do you document this work, how do you kind of show different perspectives. I see my next project connected to this. And I want to end with showing you just a brief portrait. It was a documentary film that I did with an undergraduate student of one of the men participants. And it gives an experience of this person's life history and what work like this, what work in literacy and humanities is potential. So I'll end with this short video. It's about 7 minutes.
Our children, like, you just want the best for them, you just want the best for them. because you know what they're up against. So everything
I
was
did not
flaring.
want to be there.
No. I don't know, where were you going with a turtleneck, man? It was summertime. Well, my name is Vincent Moody. I am 62 years of age, born January 18th, 1962, in Kings County Hospital in Brooklyn, where I spent the majority of my childhood in a project called That. It's in the Brownsville section of Brooklyn. 8 siblings in a single parent household. My dad deceased age 40, and I was 5 years of age. Like in my early teens, I had gotten introduced to drugs. You know, I mean, it was nothing to see the heroin addicts, the alcoholics. I tried it for the first time. I'll never forget his name. His name was Chicken George. We called him. His real name was Charlie. I would always see him. He was always singing and happy and either nodding or something, but there was just something about him that I wanted to try what he was doing. But he was the first gentleman to give me a taste of what destroyed my life. The great forgetting, F.R. Martinez. We had the key to unlock all doors, but discovered too late some doors should remain that we should perhaps abstain. Having the key is the first mirage. Knowing is the first excitement. Power is the great mistake. Learning is the last enlightenment. 9th grade, I dropped out of school after being arrested. I was on the train with a friend of mine. We chose to commit a crime, to take something from someone that didn't belong to us. And as a result, we were both sent to Rikers Island. And that changed things. That changed things tremendously. Every time I have been incarcerated, other than my last stint, was definitely related to substance abuse, and to be exact, heroin use. I'd go do whatever, come home, and I'd do heroin the same day, literally, sometimes the same day. After being away from it for over a year, I'd do it the same day. My PO, probation officer, parole officer, decided that I needed help, not incarceration. It was obvious that that wasn't the solution for me. Wow. Now this picture here, I know the day we took this, but we didn't tell us.
Oh, 16.
Yeah, we didn't know about that. I can honestly say that this is probably the happiest and most content part of my life is now. You know, my relationship with my wife, which has had its bumps along the way, with my kids, you know, and to be a part of my grandchild's birth. These are really some of my best years right now.
I think it's interesting that a light can shine behind a truth so hard to bear, too impossible to share.
It's really profound. It was a nice piece, and we were just coming up. Everybody was coming up on this piece. Everybody was like sharing their own, finding pieces in it, and like, what does that mean to you? After being away from a classroom, then coming and having this art, you know, but some of it was so beautiful. Inside the razor wire fence, she was a number, a throwaway, unseen. But outside the fence, she was a mother, a daughter, a sister, a friend, someone who was missed so true. Her name was Rachel. You know, inside the razor wire, she was just a number. That's all you are, a throwaway. You know, as I always say, we're just a waste of time. There's so many people that need help, are in prison, and not getting the help that they need. And Project Manhattan, I had a gentleman whom I knew, and he told me about this wonderful program, and had mentioned you, Professor Patrick. I didn't know what to expect, and when I did arrive, it was great. Project Manhattan was a place where, no matter where you came from, no matter what your background was, we all were there for the same common goal, and that was to take these prison stories, read them, edit them, and pick the best ones to put together something that I'm proud to have been a part of, that I have my copy sitting on my dresser. I'm not special. I know that. I didn't do anything unique or wonderful. Not really. I simply listened to a voice that I had hidden away many years ago. Now I do my best to listen for those whispers from the universe, of God, and whatever. They aren't always easy, as clear as the last one, and I don't always succeed, but I'm trying. I hope the Colonel will be proud. I remember this stuff. This photo came up. I remember seeing this photo. You know, one of the things that when you asked me that question, I put it free from life, and more of like the life diction, incarceration, the image, and all the things that once bound me, you know, and I thought would define me. I remember saying to my mother that I would never be nothing, and why was she wasting her time? She didn't like that. She didn't like that. But I remember that. I remember that. I remember sitting in the kitchen table. Life had taken me there, you know. When I told my mother that, and she said, yes, you are. You're the son. You're a child of God. Never forgot that. And I always said that I was never going to let that happen to my family. They were not going to suffer because of my choices. And that helped me to make my mind up to be the place I am today. Society will view us as throwers. Like, and I never understood that. You do the crime, you sentence me to an amount of time, but it seems like I pay for that for the rest of my life. You know, I'm never forgiven. And a lot of people, I think we don't forgive ourselves. And it's programs even like men that continue to just feel good being a part of, because when you're there, and you're there, not just physically, but when you're there and a part of it, you know, the people and experiences and stories, and, you know, made a difference in my life. That's all I know.
So I think I'm going to end there because of time, but I put a QR code and we have some issues up here. Please feel free to take it. But I guess the point that I wanted to maybe leave with is this sense of building networks across our university, and sort of thinking about this as not only being something that we're doing for others, but I think this work makes us as a university, it becomes like really valuable for our students and just really creating a richer perspective. So thank you all.
Okay, hello people. My name is Seth Davis. I'm an assistant professor of English and communications at Lemoyne College, a small historically black college in my hometown, the birthplace of, the home of the blues and the birthplace of rock and roll, Memphis, Tennessee. So, as you may have heard the title at General Assembly or at the awards last night, you know, my presentation is based on the C's Lavender Award for non-traditional scholarly texts, Unbuckling the Bible Belt, Black Queer Cruising in Memphis. Okay, so how did all of this begin? So all of this really began by me moving home and my existing interest in how Black queer people reimagined literacy. So specifically, I'd already been studying how it is that Black queer people used shade, the term shade, cruising, and even the term trade to kind of reorganize or reorient how it is that we understood. I'm not going to say how we understood, no, in ways to articulate how Black queer people understood the world differently, but also in conversation with larger norms. Like I'm ripping off of Eric Pritchard's Fashion Law, specifically his theory of literacy normativity, that oftentimes what I ran into, I'm ripping off of his notion of literacy normativity, but I'm also ripping off of Chris Retton's notion of literacy narratives and Jonathan Alexander's notion of sexual literacy, in the sense that when talking to queer people, often oftentimes we live in the same world but understand the world in totally different ways, or in conversation with normative or white supremacist notions of the world. So examples of this is shade, the idea that I can insult you by giving you a compliment. That's a nice shirt for you. You know, you have to have an alternative reading in order to understand that as an insult. If you just go and take that to a friend, they're going to say, Seth gave you a compliment. What do you mean? Same thing with trade. This idea that there are men who identify as straight but that engage in queer sex. And that them engaging in queer sex doesn't necessarily invalidate their heterosexual identities, especially amongst heterosexuals. And so oftentimes, how I studied both of these terms was by going to DC Black Pride and by going to Harlem Pride and interviewing Black queer people about these terms and how they use them. And so what I ended up learning is that these weren't just slang terms that needed to be translated, but represented larger literacy practices. So specifically with trade, one thing that I ran into as my participants were trying to define what trade was, these straight men that do gay shit, they had to essentially tell stories to do that, because essentially when you just say it, especially to a straight person, they're like, what, doesn't that mean they're not straight? What do you mean? That makes no sense. But if you live in a homophobic, heteronormative society, it makes all the fucking sense in the world, you know? So with that being said, that's the larger kind of theoretical framework of this project that I'm working on now, that essentially Black queer people have a whole different ways of seeing and understanding the world, a whole different literacy practice that is in conversation and is oftentimes attempting to dismantle normative, white supremacist, Eurocentric notions of literacy and who's talking and what is literacy. So now to unbuckling the Bible belt. So what this project centers around is, a little bit about me. So after graduating Syracuse, yes, I'm a Q's person, yay, go. This is kind of the Syracuse panel. After graduating Syracuse, and while I was in grad school, I said, anywhere but my hometown of Memphis. I'm never going back to live in the South. I'm never going back to live in Memphis again. Cannot do it. While yet still being miserable in Syracuse and Muncie, Indiana. Neither here nor there. But what happened was two things happened. I got a new job in Boston, and you know Boston has its own specific racial politics, progressive LGBTQ-wise, but as far as race, it's a rough thing being Black in Boston. Let me just throw that out there. But also, two things happened, and a couple of you guys already know this. My dad passed, but then also COVID hit, as in the pandemic lockdown, a week after his funeral. I went back to Boston, and then everything locked down. And it hit me that after a month or so, that if I died of COVID, I'd be laid up in this one-bedroom apartment. I don't really have any friends or family in Boston. And I also determined that I was like, if my mom lives for another 6 months or 60 years, I want to be there for that. So I moved home. So in moving home, I had to answer the question, so where do you find men? Shit, you know, that is a need everywhere you go. And thinking of places like New York, Atlanta, DC, you go to the gay club. Or like a Chicago, there's a whole neighborhood. You go to Boys Town and hang out. But when you start talking about beneath the Bible Belt, then you start talking about there's not as many gay spaces, and those gay spaces are typically raced as white. And so with that being said, in Memphis, there are plenty of bars like the Pumping Station. Well, let me take that back. There ain't plenty. There's the Pumping Station, which is the leather bar. There is Drew's, which is a drag bar. But if you go in there, you're not going to find Black men. Period. You are not rolling up in there and seeing Black men. Because the whole race is white. And deeper than that, even if we're not talking about queer spaces, Memphis is raced as fuck. Like, this is something that I forgot being away for 15 years, but coming back. Like, I live in Cordova, and there's this street called Germantown Parkway. There's about 5 different bars on it, Mexican restaurants, Irish pubs. All of them are raced as hell. My bar, Happy Mexican, is white during the day. Then at 5:30, they turn on the blues and old school R&B, and that's when the last white couple leaves, and now it's a Black bar. So everything in the South is very much so raced and gendered and sexed and sexualized. So that brings me to my project. So following this idea of literacy narrative, and let me just say, all of my fonts didn't translate. This was cuter on my laptop than it is on this laptop. So using notion of literacy narratives. Remember, so this is specific to our field, but also when we're talking about feminist writings, or we're talking about African American history or Black history, stories, narrative, oral histories have always played a big role in how we tell our stories or how we relay information. Specifically, many of us grew up asking a parent for advice or asking a parent a yes or no question, only to get a long-ass story that we're supposed to deduce a message from, you know. And as you grow up and get older and get grown, you can deduce more messages from it as you get older. So coming back to Memphis. So when we're talking about Memphis history broadly, and I mean it in a kind of like white supremacy Eurocentric literacy normative way, we're thinking about Andrew Jackson and the real estate deal that would end up settling Tennessee and Memphis. It's not like they wanted people to be happy or live free. You know, Tennessee and Memphis were founded just because they wanted to sell more land, of course. Also, then I'm thinking of the Cowpow Indians and the Choctaw indigenous people that occupied that space that were trailed right up out of there. One piece of Memphis history is Stage Road, aka Highway 64, was originally a road done by buffalo. And then the natives then started using the road, and then we paved over it. And now, or not now, then that road became the same road that became the Trail of Tears out of Memphis. How's that for some history for you? And so that is a part of the racial politics of Memphis too. There are two other things that were a little bit more. Okay, so then also I'm thinking of other historical moments are yellow fever taking out almost half of the population, mostly white population. If we even think of Memphis as a Black city, we got to engage both slave trade, Memphis being one of the capitals of the slave trade, but also yellow fever, you know, and then white flight. So when it comes down to my study of Martin Luther King Riverside Park, I found this park because I was on Twitter cruising for men, and it kept coming up, this park. I'm meeting up at MLK Riverside Park. So I went, and every single time I've gone, one, a picture shows this already. One, you're going to see used condoms, lube, paper towels, baby wipes, all that. One, I love it as an archive because one, on two levels, you know folks were out there because that's out there. Now, for those of us that do sexual health work, you also know somebody doing some sexual health work if they're using condoms too. So that's something too. But you see all that, but also every single time I went out there, I saw people fucking. Every time. And so that's not the only park in Memphis. And a matter of fact, Overton Park is our version of, what's the park in New York City? Y'all know which one I'm talking about. Central Park, designed by the same people. So that was the part that they put all of their funds into and all the programming, while MLK Riverside Park in the early 1900s was kind of a way trip. Now keep in mind, thanks to segregation, I wasn't welcome there. Just got to put that out there, that this was meant to be a elite white folks day trip, you know, in the early 1900s. But what ends up going on is the develop. Well, actually, I'll get into that in a second. So there are three stories that really kind of capture what is special about MLK Riverside Park. Now, keep in mind, just that it's a cruising park, that's not special. Y'all got cruising parks in every single city. Syracuse, Thorndon Park, that was where I really first started getting the idea of what it is that I'm doing. Perfect example of literacy communities. I know it as a cruising park. Gwen been there much longer than me at Syracuse. But then, you get what I'm saying. Same thing in Memphis. Everyone knows good and damn well that is a hookup park. But every time I talk to it with, let's say, a straight man, what are you doing? Oh, I didn't know that. But then on the flip side, if I get caught out there, if I get arrested, everybody in Memphis knows what I was doing out there. That's what we're talking about with this in-group, out-group when we're talking about literacies and literacy communities. Okay, so coming back to these three stories that I want to tell, and they're going to be quick. So first is the story of Francis Thompson and the Memphis Race Massacre. Have any of y'all ever heard of Francis Thompson? Oh, all right then. I get to really break it down in here. So, rewind. Let's go back to 1866, Memphis, Tennessee. I can't say a great time. But what's interesting about Memphis, specifically during the Civil War, is that it was one of the first cities to fall. So Memphis during the Civil War was a place that a lot of black people or formerly enslaved black folks ran away to, which also contributes to the color demographics of Memphis. So 1866 was the Great Memphis Race Massacre, where, as y'all know, these white folks, these white Irish folks, these white cops were upset about black progress in that city, and so felt the need to burn down all of South Memphis, including my school. Lemoyne Owen College was burnt to the ground by white supremacists. What else? And let me just say, so can you imagine what this small historical black college would do with that money that they spent to rebuild after that if we had it now? Okay, so Memphis Race Massacre. Okay, so they burned down, loot, and you know what else they did to the black community. So Frances Thompson, she's considered nowadays what we consider a trans woman. She was living in a boarding house with some cisgender other black women. And one thing I gotta pause and say just in that moment, these were women seeing each other in 1866. Y'all following what I'm getting at? So the riot breaks out. The white Irish men and cops take over their house. You know what they did. I don't have to explain it. It's also greatly reported. And not to mention, it's been in every movie about enslavement and time in the 1800s and all that. Y'all know what they did. So with that being said, that's not where the story ends, though. So then Congress started to investigate the Memphis Massacre. And so Frances Thompson and her board mates testified before Congress. And you know what the white men in Memphis tried to do? They did the same thing that men do today. Two things. One, they spread words that they were whores, that they were sex workers, so they could not be trusted. And then most importantly, they said, hell no, you can't believe Frances Thompson. She's a man. She's masquerading. Da, 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 da. They still do that today. And keep in mind, when I started on this presentation, all this Trump shit and the new shit wasn't. So that's why I'm like, this is where we are. They still testify. And keep in mind, y'all can Google it, those Congress testimonies. They're harrowing. It was rough to get through. But with that being said, if they hadn't told their story, their narrative, I would have never known that a black queer woman, black trans woman lived in Memphis, Tennessee 100 years ago. Y'all following what I'm getting at? This is what Eric Pritchard is talking about, literacy normativity, and how these stories destabilize that. Second story. Now this one I'm not going to stay on too long because most of y'all are somewhat familiar with it because Martin Luther King, Dr. Martin Luther King, my fraternity brother, is arguably the most famous black person to live. So with that being said, y'all know why he was in Memphis. Mayor Henry Lowe gave no fuck about sanitation workers. As in, sanitation workers were being killed in the machine that was compacting them. Everybody they strike. There was trash all over Memphis. He still gave no fuck. So they had to call in Martin Luther King. So Martin Luther King came and helped in assist the sanitation workers strike. Now keep in mind, tried to strike one time and it also got stopped because there was looting and breaking. It got wild in one of the protests, or not protests, one of the, it was a protest, one of the walks that they tried to do to bring attendance to it. But keep in mind, Martin Luther King was also talking about poor people during this time, and the poor people can't pay. So needless to say, y'all know he was assassinated April 4th, 1968. And Memphis, just like every other city across the nation, decided, oh, we like Martin Luther King now. So let's name shit after him, especially stuff in the black community, So that's how what was formerly Riverside Park, this all-white park that was invented that established in the early 1900s became Martin Luther King Riverside Park. Y'all following? That's how we get the name. So then, white flight happens. Keep in mind, this is the 60s. White flight happens. And I also got a plug. Lemoyne Owen College students were the ones who sat in and made it so that all black folks in Memphis can go to the libraries, can go to the museums, and basically do the type of work that I I'm doing now. But what's important to understand about that park is a couple things happen. One is that they built a oil refinery next to it. Two, they never invested to develop it as much as Overton Park. And then last but not least, the interstate system. So they built I-55, which separates this park from the rest of the city. So now, since all of that, it's a very secluded park with nothing really else going there. Now keep in mind, there are other events that happen like the Catfish Relay, and there are types of Greek picnics and other stuff like that. But no, the major reputation for that park in Memphis is that's where you go and get some. The last story that I want to share with y'all really is the story that I've been telling now. As in, I'm that guy who promised to never go back to Memphis, never was going to live in the South again, only to realize, no, that's where the work was. So whether we're like, for instance, living in New York, living in Boston, I'd have to wait in line. I'd be 20th in line being a gay man investigating gay culture in these spaces. But what I've learned by doing this work, and also from the readers for the Lavender Awards Committee, they helped me understand that I was presenting a counter story, a counter history of Memphis. You know, how I didn't know that already. I thought I was just digging for dirt. But what it encouraged me to understand is to not look at our histories or look at our stories just through these scripted ways. And specifically when we're understanding space and how Black queer space works. In a lot of ways, on one hand, we don't have the privilege for the spaces to be, let's say, land-ownered 50, 100 years, like Boys Town is, has been there for 100 years, Oftentimes, Black folks don't have the material resources in order to perpetuate such lineages. But then I've had to flip my perspective and to say, maybe that's for the best. Wait, is Black queer survival sometimes being under the radar? Is the fact that you don't know where I'm going to be every weekend. So you can't just blow that shit up or burn it down. Y'all following what I'm getting at? So that's basically what I took from this work, is that we need, as literacy or composition people, to think more critically about how we're telling stories and using stories to talk about certain phenomena, but also where we're looking for histories. This one, you gotta look in, and I'm riffing off of Patrick now, sometimes you have to look in arrest records in order to tell the histories of the people that have been here and the people who have made a difference, et cetera, et cetera. So, one more thing. I didn't have the QR code on there, my bad, but I do have a QR code for unbuckling the Bible belt up here on this, or my one business card. Don't ask me why I didn't bring any more. Like, I just have one business card in my wallet. But again, feel free to search Unbuckling the Bible Belt on YouTube. It'll come right up. But also, if you just want to do a scan of it, feel free to come up and scan it. So thank you for your time. Okay, so I guess we're in the question and answer period. Both of my panelists deserted me up here on the panel. Yes and no. As in, I don't get any money from any white man to do my work. No one's giving me anything. My school, anyone. I film all my own shit. I record all my own shit. So with that being said, coming back to when people ask, now what? Now at this moment, what to do? Well, if you were doing the work, continue doing the work, Because part of my issue was when I quit my job, I thought to myself, I don't have a platform anymore. Who am I? If I'm not employed as a professor, am I even a professor? Am I even an intellectual anymore? Bullshit. That's why I established my YouTube channel, Seth University, with only 9 followers, but it's mine. You get what I'm saying? It's mine, and I'm able to discuss these things. And just because some orange fool that doesn't understand anything wants to defund stuff, my stuff ain't going anywhere.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'll say quickly. I mean, I think Seth is exactly right. Like if you're finding ways to do the work with limited resources across different kinds of coalitions already. So it's not a moment of scrambling to say, what should we be doing in this moment? How do we support X, Y, or Z? Or how do we build solidarity or act in particular ways? Engaged Humanities Network is like designed as a mutual aid network to begin with, and the resources are distributed. So we're not like getting giant funding from NSF either, or NEH, but we are getting pockets of funding from local supporters, local foundations, funding from the university. And it does, I mean, it always feels a little precarious. It never feels like, oh, this thing is stable and built for all time. It always feels like you're hustling, you're putting things together. It's like bubble gum and, duct tape. But there's part of like what I was trying to get us to think around is like, there is a sense that the shape of that kind of work can sort of be under the radar in some cases, dynamic, responsive. The relationships already exist. The relationships are the work. And if they exist, you can mobilize you can respond in all kinds of ways that don't necessarily need to be overly overt, but sometimes they do need to be. So yeah, it's a good question, but I think, and certainly I feel like it could blow up tomorrow, and we'd have to continue to find other ways to do the work.
I think these are great points. The only thing I'll add is I feel like when I finished my PhD, I never thought that I would spend so much time writing grants. And so like issues of sustainability, I feel like have been like ongoing, just trying to find ways of finding support, because sometimes I got some initial support from the university. I got a little bit of support here and there, but a lot of it is like learning how to work with different agencies and thinking about different organizations that might be interested. Like yesterday I was at a session and someone brought up, oh, you should think about this area of the government. And I'm thinking, really? But anyhow, but I think that this issue of like trying to find grants and then also thinking about scale, like I wonder if I lose enough funding, will I have to like scale the project down? I'm hoping this is going to be something that I can continue for a long time. But, it always feels a little uneasy.
Yeah.
These answers are really heartening, and I appreciate them very much. I think I'm also thinking, I have a green card, I'm a green card holder, not a citizen, and I'm thinking of, Seth, I know you're not funded, but you're saying controversial, you're DEI-ing all over the place, all over your YouTube channel. They can still.
Well, I'm DEI all over the place too. I didn't know that thing. I can't help it,
I'm feeling fear for what I say in ways I've never felt fear for what I say in my life. Because I'm in a precarious position, and I'm not in half the precarious position of some of your students and participants and Seth, you. But I'm fearful for what I'm saying. Your answers are making me feel very hopeful and connected, but it's scary for people who aren't citizens.
Yeah.
Or who have what we thought were permanent, like my green card used to feel like practically a citizen.
Right.
And now I don't feel that way anymore.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. It's a fearful time, and we're experiencing it so differently given our status, bodies, positions. I mean, there's really no common experience of the moment, which is part of the challenge. But if you're doing the work that you're doing with community, with coalition, then you don't always have to be the one that is most vocal. It's time for people who have some, well, it's been time for a long time for people with privilege to step up, but this is a moment definitely where, we should understand that it's time for other people to rotate in when they can rotate in and take risks when they're able to take risks, because we're doing this as a collective. But yeah, but you're right. Okay. Yeah.
Thinking about Ryan's story and like this trajectories, and maybe it's part of like how you have to go very quickly over material thing, but like this sometimes sound like exceptional stories, like these are exceptions, these are people
Yeah.
who somehow like had lucked out or like learned how to hack interaction with institutions, but this is not really the way that institutions are meant to work. And my question is more like, is this a problem? Like, should we understand this like, if this is exceptionality, well, is this a problem in some way?
Yeah, I mean, I think, right, there are all kinds of ways. I mean, one, Rayon is like exceptional, but she definitely is not. I mean, there could be, I don't know, you saw 80 people. I could have like kind of thought about the different types of trajectories of all 80 of those people, plus like the, dozens and hundreds of other students that are working. So I think people make their own ways, and they make shapes through institutions. Sometimes they have like barriers and blocks to the different directions they want to go. But people like Rayon and people that we're working with across all of these contexts are like sort of they're making their own spaces with others, like in collaboration, and they're interconnecting the kinds of institutional resources from neighborhood community center to research university and a lot in between, to sort of, I hope, like, give us a picture of how our kind of educational ecosystems could look differently if we just follow the people, if we recognize what was happening across all these spaces. So I think there is a problem with institutions for sure. I absolutely think that's right. But there are also openings and possibilities within institutions. And if we think of them as like monolithic, I think like we imagine them, and bounded like we usually imagine them, then we somehow like these acts of resourcefulness, innovation, get like, that they're invisible or they're not counted as part of what the institution is. So Syracuse University or, Canagarajah High School where Rayon graduated from, they don't get counted as this space where this kind of innovation is possible. They get counted as this like monolithic thing that either needs to be like smashed with a hammer from the right or, reformed from within on the left, or Rage Against the Machine on the left. It just, both of them are, anyway. Yeah, I hope that's helpful.
I have a question, but it really is about me. Brice and Patrick, specifically, you're familiar with my work, right? But for the three of you, you're doing work that you're doing scholarship, but it's very public facing, and it invites perspectives of the people, right? Thinking about material, if you're thinking about people's corporeal bodies and how they exist in spaces and how our world impacts them in very real ways, right? However, my work again is very theoretical at this point, because I'm not beginning this journey, but I'm new-ish, as Syracuse's emails keep telling me, right? So
You're junior forever.
I will be that, and that's how it feels sometimes. But how would you advise someone like me to take the work that I've already done and extend it beyond just the theoretical? Because that is something that I really want and need to do. I don't want my work to just be work done for the sake of like being on the tenure track.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I want it to mean something beyond the classroom and beyond like just me being a professor or anything. I really want and need that, and I need to keep doing that, but I haven't figured out or been able to really even have time to think through it, how to do that. So how would you suggest that someone like me like begin that journey? So that question's for anybody on the panel.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not going to answer the question.
Yeah, but I
Okay, I was gonna say we're hit this time.
Yeah. We can take it outside.
Y'all need to get up.
Yeah. We'll take it outside. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. No, I know. We're just going to hold this space for